The sun had barely brushed the horizon on the morning of July 11th, 1804, when two figures stepped silently onto a rocky ledge above the Hudson River at Weehawken, New Jersey. One was Aaron Burr, the sitting Vice President of the United States. The other was Alexander Hamilton, a towering mind behind the new nation's financial system. Once allies in the struggle for independence, they now faced each other in an ultimate reckoning born of political rivalry, bruised pride, and the age-old code of honor. At that desolate dueling ground, hidden from the bustling streets of nearby New York, the air was thick with tension. Two shots cracked into the dawn hush, and Hamilton collapsed, struck by a bullet that would claim his life the next day in Greenwich Village. But to understand how a man who helped shape the United States Constitution and design its economic foundations ended up here, we must first go back, far away, to a tropical island torn by wind and water. Long before the smoke of musket fire and political pamphlets, a young Alexander Hamilton stood on the docks of St. Croix in the Caribbean, an orphaned boy, watching a devastating hurricane tear through the island. The fury of that storm, and the eloquence of his letter describing it, would set him on a path from obscurity to the heart of a revolution. This is not just the story you think you know from Broadway. It is a tale of genius and ambition, love and scandal, devotion and heartbreak, and a legacy that still shapes America today. If you love deep dives into history with all the nuance behind the legend, subscribe to the channel, hit like, and let's discover the real Alexander Hamilton, beyond the musical. Chapter 1. Bastard in the Caribbean. Long before Alexander Hamilton's name was stitched into the fabric of American memory, long before the din of revolution and the echo of pistols at Weehawken, there was the tiny, sun-bleached island of Nevis in the British West Indies. It was here, in Charlestown, that a boy was born into circumstances that would mark him from the start. His birth out of wedlock, in either 1755 or 1757, would shadow his earliest years. His mother, Rachel Fawcett Levine, had left a troubled marriage to be with a Scottish trader, James Hamilton, and when Alexander entered the world, he was, by the strict social codes of the day, a bastard. Yet even in this humble beginning, there were hints of a mind that would defy expectation and rise high above it. Nevis was a place of stark contrasts, sugar plantations bathed in golden sunlight, and the brutal realities of colonial life, undergirded by enslaved labor and relentless commerce. For Alexander and his older brother James, childhood was framed by instability. Their father's fortunes never matched his ambitions, and in 1765 he abandoned the family altogether. Rachel, left to shoulder the burden alone, moved the boys to the nearby island of St. Croix and tried to make ends meet through small-scale commerce. But fate was unkind. In 1768, Rachel, worn thin by hardship and disease, died of a fever, leaving the brothers effectively orphans in a colonial world where community ties could be tenuous. The Protestant Church, wary of his illegitimacy, offered no easy educational path for young Alexander. Nevertheless, he began writing and working to support himself and his brother, first in modest shops and then at an import-export firm, Beekman and Kruger, as a clerk. No small role for someone barely into his teens. Here, amidst invoices and ledgers, something remarkable began to stir. In letters and written accounts, he displayed a clarity of thought and command of language that belied his age and his station. These early writings, filled with an urgency and ambition that set him apart, caught the attention of local merchants and civic leaders. They saw not a forgotten island orphan, but a young man with a restless intellect and a hunger for something beyond the sugar-scented Caribbean. In the quiet rhythm of dockyard commerce, Alexander Hamilton's life was slowly unfolding into a story much larger than Nevis. A story of ambition, resilience, and an unquenchable drive to rise. A story that was only just beginning. Chapter 2. Storm Girl. The Caribbean sun can feel gentle, even soothing. But on the night of August 31st, 1772, it belied the raw power hurtling toward St. Croix, a storm force so massive that by modern reckoning, it would be labeled a major hurricane and remembered as one of the most violent to strike the Leeward Islands that century. From the wind-tossed sea rose a fury that would shake every building, uproot every tree, and drown the night in an uproar of crashing timber and shrieking wind. The earth itself seemed to quake. For a 17-year-old clerk named Alexander Hamilton, this was not just weather. It was a collision between nature and destiny. In Christiansted, the Danish port town where Hamilton worked for a local trading firm, the storm tore through the streets and markets he knew so well. For hours, he witnessed chaos unbound. Houses shattered, ships driven ashore, terrified families frantically seeking refuge. As the wreckage quieted with dawn's coming light, the island's suffering was vast and palpable, a community reeling in shock. Rather than retreat into silence, Hamilton did what he knew best. He wrote. From the wreckage of the hurricane's aftermath, he composed a long, intense letter to his father, attempting to capture both the storm's ferocity and its deeper meaning. In language that seemed to see beyond mere destruction, he described the roaring of the sea and wind and the ear-piercing shrieks of the distressed, even as he pondered what such calamity might mean for the human spirit. A local Presbyterian minister named Hugh Knox, who also worked with the fledgling Royal Danish American Gazette, recognized something extraordinary in Hamilton's account. Knox convinced the young man to allow the letter's publication, whereupon the vivid narrative caused an unexpected sensation among island leaders and merchants. They were struck not just by the accuracy of the description, but by the emotional and intellectual depth of the author's voice. In a moment that would change the trajectory of his life, these businessmen and benefactors, moved by the promise they saw in a young clerk's words, raised funds to send Hamilton across the sea to the North American mainland for formal education. What had begun as an ordinary clerk's response to nature's terror had become, quite literally, his passage off the island. That hurricane, destructive and unrelenting, became Hamilton's unlikely catalyst. In the storm's wake, his pen carried him beyond the confines of St. Croix to a destiny intertwined with revolution, nation-building, and a legacy that would resonate long after those winds had faded. Chapter 3. King's College and the Call to Revolt. When Alexander Hamilton arrived in New Jersey in late 1772, he stepped out of the tropical sun of the Caribbean into a world already brimming with political tension and intellectual ferment. The growing disquiet among the American colonies over British taxes, trade restrictions, and questions of rights had begun to mark the years before open conflict. Yet for Hamilton, still in his late teens, the pull of education was just as compelling as the stirrings of political upheaval. After preparatory studies at Barber's Academy in Elizabethtown, he made his way to King's College in New York City in 1773-74, a place that would both shape his mind and set him squarely on the path toward revolution. King's College was more than a school. It was a crossroads of ideas. In its lecture halls and common rooms, debates about liberty, imperial power, and natural rights grew louder with each passing month. For the young immigrant from the Caribbean, accustomed to observing the world with both clarity and ambition, these discussions were irresistible. He struggled with certain academic disciplines, like mathematics, but his gift for language and argument quickly distinguished him. Private tutors helped him sharpen those skills, and he threw himself into classical rhetoric, philosophy, and history with an intense focus that hinted at a restless intellect that would not be easily satisfied. As tensions between colonists and the British Crown escalated in 1774, Hamilton moved from the periphery to the center of political discourse. At a time when many scholars confined themselves to abstract discussion, Hamilton began to put pen to paper. Under the pseudonym A Friend to America, he penned a bold pamphlet titled A Full Vindication of the Measures of Congress, defending the act of the First Continental Congress and rebuking loyalist critics. Soon after came The Farmer Refuted, a more expansive argument that challenged the pro-British writings of Samuel Seabury and dissected the philosophical foundations of colonial resistance. These pamphlets, vivid in reasoning and unflinching in conviction, drew attention far beyond the campus. Yet Hamilton was not a reckless firebrand. Even as he argued for collective resistance, he recoiled from mob violence. In May 1775, when a raucous crowd threatened the college's president, a loyalist, Hamilton stood before them with measured words, buying time for the man to escape without bloodshed. It was a moment of paradox, a young advocate for change, shielding a symbol of the old order, not out of loyalty, but out of principle. In these college years, Hamilton's intellectual awakening took shape. The rigors of classical study, the turbulence of colonial politics, and his own fierce ambition coalesced into something potent, an unshakable belief that ideas, articulated with clarity and force, could alter the course of history. Long before he joined the battlefield or won Washington's ear, his voice had already entered the chorus of revolution. Sharp, articulate, and impossible to ignore. Chapter 4. Captain Hamilton. In the spring of 1776, the young Alexander Hamilton stood upon a new threshold. Barely 20 years old, he had already earned a reputation as a passionate advocate for colonial rights. Now, through the influence of New York patriots and the increasingly urgent call to arms, he received an official commission as captain of the New York Provincial Company of Artillery on March 14, 1776. It was a remarkable turning point. The Caribbean orphan had become a military leader in the struggle to define a nation. Hamilton's artillery company was small, roughly 60 men drawn from the bustling port city and its countryside. Yet, under his command, it became a disciplined and effective unit, drilled with the precision of a man determined not just to participate in this war, but to excel in it. Hamilton devoured military manuals, trained with intensity, and quickly demonstrated a gift for leadership that exceeded his tender years. That summer and autumn, as British forces advanced toward New York City, Hamilton's battery held its place in a chaotic campaign. Opposing the world's greatest imperial power was humiliation and retreat, as often as it was triumph. But Hamilton's courage under fire was notable. During the Continental Army's withdrawal up Manhattan, his artillery provided vital rearguard actions that helped slow the British advance. At a time when the Patriots' dream seemed fragile, his coolness in crisis and the precision of his command marked him as a soldier of rising promise. Winter in the colonies was bitter, but hardship seldom daunted the young captain. On December 26, 1776, General George Washington launched a daring surprise attack on the Hessian garrison at Trenton, New Jersey, after crossing the icy Delaware River. Hamilton's artillery was positioned at a strategic high point in the town, and when the order came to fire, his guns barked out across the frost-bitten fields. The roar of cannon and the thunder of grape shot helped shatter the Hessian defense, delivering a crucial victory that reinvigorated the faltering revolutionaries. Just days later, at Princeton, Hamilton's men again played a vital role. In the frigid dawn of January 3, 1777, Washington's forces engaged British troops near the town's college grounds. Hamilton moved his cannons into position around Nassau Hall, and their pounding fire proved decisive. The British eventually raised a white flag and surrendered. These twin victories, Trenton and Princeton, not only buoyed the morale of the Continental Army, but also burnished Hamilton's own reputation as a courageous and capable leader. For Hamilton, war was more than strategy and courage. It was a proving ground. He had dreamed of greatness long before the first shot of the revolution, but now, under fire and in command, that ambition found both form and notoriety. The same restless intellect that had made him a compelling pamphleteer now shaped him into a soldier, determined to carve his name into the history of a nation in birth. Chapter 5. Washington's Aide-de-Camp. In the winter of 1777, after bitter campaigns and countless marches, Alexander Hamilton stood on the brink of a new chapter in the American Revolution, one that would carry him not only into the center of the war, but into the confidence and counsel of General George Washington himself. Hamilton had proven his mettle as a young captain in the artillery, fighting at Trenton and Princeton, and his talents had not gone unnoticed by the commander-in-chief. In March 1777, Washington invited him to serve on his personal staff with the rank of lieutenant colonel, a position that would put him at the heart of the Continental Army's struggle and shape the rest of his life. To be aide-de-camp to Washington was to join an inner circle sometimes referred to as the general's military family. These aides were the indispensable hands and minds around Washington, drafting orders, preparing correspondence, and translating his intent into action across the sprawling war effort. Washington described aides-de-camp as men in whom entire confidence must be placed, requiring ability, discretion, and dispatch. Hamilton possessed all three. His pen as swift as any soldier's saber, his intellect honed by years of writing and argument. Hamilton's duties were both vast and intimate. By day, and often deep into the night, he sat at Washington's desk, drafting letters to the Continental Congress, state governors, and senior officers of the new army. Each dispatch carried the weight of the revolution: orders for troop movements, appeals for supplies, requests for reinforcements, and even negotiations with foreign officers newly allied with the American cause. Sometimes these letters bore Hamilton's own hand over Washington's signature, a testament to the trust the general placed in his judgment and skill. Yet the gravity of his role did not temper Hamilton's youthful impatience. He admired Washington, the physical presence of stoic resolve that anchored the Continental Army through its darkest hours. But he also chafed beneath the strict discipline and the slow pace of headquarters life. He longed for action, for the roar of battle and the chance to prove himself not merely as a scribe of war, but as a commander upon the field. Even as Hamilton worked ceaselessly to translate Washington's strategic vision into the written word, he continued to grow as a leader in his own right. His fluency in French made him a vital liaison with Allied officers like the Marquis de Lafayette and Baron von Steuben, bridging language and cultural gaps as French forces arrived to aid the revolutionaries. He also undertook delicate missions on Washington's behalf, traveling to distant commands to secure reinforcements or to urge cooperation among wary generals. Despite the closeness of their professional relationship, Hamilton struggled with a persistent sense of insecurity. Washington was a figure of almost mythic calm and authority. Hamilton, by contrast, was restless, fierce in ambition, and unaccustomed to patience. Their bond was one of mutual respect and shared purpose, but not the easy affection of equals. Washington remained the commanding presence, the elder statesman and father figure, while Hamilton oscillated between a deep loyalty and silent frustration at a role that kept him behind a desk rather than at the head of troops. In the winter camp at Valley Forge, where the Continental Army endured starvation and cold, Hamilton's responsibilities went beyond correspondence. He helped organize supplies, translated military manuals, and worked alongside fellow aides under conditions that tested both body and spirit. In these harsh encampments, amid the firelight and frost, the young lieutenant colonel became less an outsider and more an indispensable pillar in Washington's war effort. A trusted subordinate whose relentless energy pushed the revolution forward, even as it sought the battlefield glory he craved. Hamilton's service as Washington's aide-de-camp would last 4 years, carrying him through the most pivotal moments of the revolution and deep into the heart of leadership itself, shaping not just strategy on the map, but the man who would emerge from this crucible, forever changed. Chapter 6. Beyond the Battlefield. By 1778, Alexander Hamilton had spent much of the Revolutionary War within the inner circle of General George Washington's headquarters, drafting orders, interpreting intelligence, and carrying urgent messages across a fractured army. In this role, he had already proved himself an indispensable strategist and scribe. But beyond the mere mechanics of war, his service pushed him into a broader, more intricate world where diplomacy, language, and the very idea of nation-building began to intertwine with the clash of muskets and cannons. The war that Hamilton helped to wage was no longer a purely colonial rebellion. By 1778, the United States had secured a formal alliance with France, cemented in the Treaty of Alliance that bound French troops and resources to the American cause. With foreign powers now deeply involved, the Continental Army's leadership needed more than tactical skill. They needed channels of understanding and cooperation between allies. Hamilton's facility with French, a skill he had cultivated long before the war, suddenly became one of his most valuable assets. As liaison officer between Washington and the French commanders and admirals, Hamilton acted as a sort of interpreter, negotiator, and cultural bridge, not merely translating words, but helping shape the mutual trust that was essential for Allied operations. He greeted visiting French leaders with respect and precision, carrying Washington's intentions into diplomatic language and translating French plans back to the Continental commander with equal care. In doing so, he came to know figures like the Marquis de Lafayette well, a young French noble whose ardor for the American cause matched Hamilton's own fierce belief in liberty, and even facilitated connections with other foreign volunteers and their officers. Yet in this broader theater of war, Hamilton grappled with the tension between mind and muscle, between bureaucratic diplomacy and battlefield glory. There were moments when he longed to return to direct command, to feel the surge of action that comes with leading men in combat. Still, in his diplomatic duties, he learned something no single battle could teach: that the birth of a nation depended as much on alliances and understanding across borders as it did on battlefield victories. In the encampments and councils where generals and foreign emissaries met, Hamilton found himself not just a scribe for orders, but a weaver of connection between peoples, languages, and political ideals. This was a different kind of fight, one that fused intellect and action, shaping not only the outcome of battles, but the very shape of a nation struggling toward independence.
Chapter 7.
Lawyer in New York. The roar of battle had faded, the muskets and campfires of the Revolution giving way to the quieter clatter of carriage wheels and the hum of commerce. For Alexander Hamilton, the end of the war in 1783 was not a moment to rest, but a new frontier to conquer. The battlefield had forged him. Its trials had sharpened his mind and steeled his ambition. Yet he now faced a different kind of challenge, building a life in peaceful society and proving himself not just as a soldier, but as a thinker, a professional, and a man of stature in the bustling port city of New York. Hamilton's transition from military aide to civilian was swift and decisive. In 1782, he moved to Albany, New York, and began intensive study of the law. In July of that year, having petitioned the state's highest court to allow his military experience to substitute for the usual long apprenticeship, he was admitted to the New York bar, a remarkable achievement for a man in his mid-20s. Soon after, he opened a law office on Wall Street, within earshot of the chiming steeples and the relentless rhythm of commerce that defined the young city. Hamilton's legal practice quickly drew attention. With his sharp mind and unflinching articulation, he tackled some of the most contentious cases of the era. Many of his early clients were former loyalists, men and women who had remained faithful to the British Crown during the Revolution and now found themselves facing lawsuits under New York's Trespass Act. To many fellow Americans, defending loyalists was an act of betrayal. But Hamilton saw beyond bitterness. He argued that justice, even for the unpopular, was essential to the republic they had fought to create, and that states must honor treaties and legal principle over vindictive impulse. This stance, though controversial, underscored his belief in the rule of law and the importance of a society governed by principle rather than passion. Alongside his courtroom battles, Hamilton's personal life took root. In 1780, he had married Elizabeth Schuyler, daughter of a prominent New York family. Now, in the post-war years, their home became a hub of family life and social engagement. 8 children would eventually fill their bustling household, grounding Hamilton's ambitions with the steady rhythms of fatherhood and domestic responsibility. Yet Hamilton's restless energy refused to be confined to the courtroom or hearth. He plunged into politics and institutional building, serving briefly in the Continental Congress, helping found the Bank of New York, and advocating for a stronger federal system to replace the fragile Articles of Confederation that had governed the fledgling nation. In this way, his legal career became a bridge, spanning the order of law, the architecture of finance, and the emerging design of a united republic.
In the courthouse and the council hall, Hamilton was not merely a man seeking success. He was a figure intent on shaping a nation. His ambition was no longer a private fire, but a public force, driving him onward into debates that would define the United States for generations to come.
Chapter 8. The Federalist Pen. When the delegates to the Constitutional Convention adjourned in Philadelphia on September 17, 1787, they believed they had drafted something extraordinary. A new blueprint for government, stronger and more unified than the fragile Articles of Confederation it would replace. The convention had wrestled with questions of sovereignty, representation, and the balance of powers, and the resulting document was both bold and controversial. For many Americans, especially in New York, where public opinion was deeply divided, ratifying this new United States Constitution was no foregone conclusion. Into this moment stepped Alexander Hamilton, a lawyer still in his 30s, but already a seasoned thinker, battle-scarred veteran, and ardent believer in a strong national government. His influence at the convention itself had been limited. His suggestion of a president for life carried little weight among delegates who were wary of anything that smacked of monarchical authority. Yet Hamilton was not deterred. If he could not fully shape the document in Philadelphia, he resolved to shape the debate over its adoption. In October 1787, he proposed an ambitious plan, a series of essays written to illuminate the principles and practicalities of the Constitution for a skeptical public. These essays, later collectively known as the Federalist Papers, would be published anonymously under the pseudonym Publius, a nod to the Roman founder of republican government. Hamilton recruited two trusted allies for the task: James Madison, his collaborator in constitutional philosophy, and John Jay, a respected elder statesman. Together, they embarked on a whirlwind intellectual campaign to defend the proposed constitution against its critics. Hamilton shouldered the bulk of the work, composing 51 of the 85 essays that would appear in New York newspapers between October 1787 and May 1788. Through these essays, he sought not merely to persuade, but to educate. In Federalist No. 1, he framed the stakes of the struggle, urging Americans to deliberate on a new constitution, out of reflection and choice, not accident and force, a plea for thoughtful engagement with the nation's future. The essays ranged in focus and tone. Some dissected the defects of the Articles of Confederation, exposing the weak central authority that had left the country unable to levy taxes, regulate commerce, or protect itself effectively. Others outlined the proposed system's mechanisms, separation of powers, checks and balances, and the division of authority among legislative, executive, and judicial branches. In Federalist No. 76 and related essays, Hamilton defended the powers of the executive branch, arguing that a strong, energetic presidency was essential to the Republic's survival. This work was far more than political advocacy. It was an exercise in nation-building through ideas.
Hamilton's essays treated the Constitution not as a static document, but as a living framework, intended to channel the tension between liberty and order into a stable and enduring republic. Although the Federalist did not immediately sway every skeptic, New York's ratification vote was narrow and hard-won. The arguments laid out by Hamilton and his collaborators provided a systematic defense of a strong federal government that resonated far beyond the immediate ratification debates. In writing these essays, Hamilton revealed the intellectual core of his ambition, the belief that ideas, articulated with clarity and force, could shape the very foundation of a nation. His pen had carried him from the hurricane-tossed docks of St. Croix to the parlors and newspapers of New York. Now, through the power of argument and principle, he helped forge the philosophical backbone of the United States, a legacy that would echo through the centuries, long after the ink had dried on the Constitution itself. Chapter 9: Treasury and the New Nation. When George Washington took the oath as the first President of the United States in April 1789, he faced a nation full of promise, but tangled in financial confusion. The new Constitution had created a stronger federal government, yet it lacked both cash and credibility. Into this breach, Washington appointed Alexander Hamilton as the country's first Secretary of the Treasury in September 1789, a choice that would reshape the economic foundations of the young republic. The enormity of the task quickly became clear. The federal government carried massive Revolutionary War debt, both to foreign creditors and to American soldiers and speculators, and the mechanisms for paying for the government's basic functions were rudimentary at best. Hamilton saw the situation not merely as an accounting problem, but as the defining crisis of America's future. In his view, a nation without stable finance could not survive as a sovereign state. His first report on public credit delivered to Congress in early 1790, proposed a bold and controversial remedy. The federal government would assume the wartime debts of the states and pay them off at full value, no matter who now held the bonds. It was a radical idea, a way to unify the states, bind wealthy creditors to the success of the Union, and establish American credit at home and abroad. Many Americans protested that this privileged speculators at the expense of ordinary citizens, but Hamilton argued that honor and reliability would, in turn, attract investment and respect for the new nation. That very struggle revealed a deep ideological fault line in Washington's cabinet. Thomas Jefferson, then Secretary of State, believed the United States should remain a largely agrarian republic, wary of centralized power and financial entanglements with commercial interests. To Jefferson and his allies, Hamilton's plans seemed to concentrate too much authority in the federal government and risked creating a system beholden to wealthy urban financiers rather than independent yeoman farmers. Despite the conflict, Hamilton won a crucial compromise in 1790. In exchange for Southern support for the assumption of state debts, the permanent national capital would be located along the Potomac River, the future Washington, D.C., a concession that helped pass the Funding Act and cement Hamilton's financial framework in law. Next came the controversial Report on a National Bank. Hamilton urged Congress to charter the Bank of the United States in 1791, a central bank that would hold federal funds, regulate currency, and issue credit to promote growth. Jefferson and his supporters saw the idea as unconstitutional, arguing that the federal government had no explicit power to create such an institution. Hamilton's counter-argument, that the Constitution allowed implied powers necessary to fulfill its responsibilities, laid the intellectual groundwork for a broader interpretation of federal authority. Congress approved the bank, and it became a keystone of the American financial system. Hamilton's vision reflected a fundamental conflict between ideology and practicality. The belief that a strong, centralized economic structure would bind the republic together and anchor its stability, versus the Jeffersonian insistence on decentralized agrarian virtue. His policies laid the groundwork for modern American finance, public credit, a national currency, and institutions that could undergird commerce and industry. In doing so, he did not merely balance books. He shaped the terms of national identity and political contention for generations to come. Chapter 10. Marriage and Family. In the winter of 1780, amidst the smoke of war and the distant rumble of battle drums, Alexander Hamilton found himself drawn not to strategy and finance, but to Elizabeth Schuyler, a young woman whose patience and gentleness stood in stark contrast to the sirens of politics and power. Elizabeth, known affectionately as Eliza, was the daughter of General Philip Schuyler, a respected commander and member of one of New York's most prominent Dutch-American families. Though Hamilton was wealthy in reputation and influence within the Continental Army, he was not wealthy in means, and Eliza's family, conscious of status and security, tested his intentions carefully. Nevertheless, their courtship blossomed swiftly through letters and shared evenings, and on December 14th, 1780, they were married in the parlor of the Schuyler Mansion in Albany, New York, a union that marked both the start of a devoted partnership and a life forever entwined with the new nation's fate. Their marriage was rooted in affection, but it was also rooted in purposeful companionship. Eliza would later be described as Hamilton's anchor, providing the steady hearth where his restless ambition could find rest. She managed their household with grace and strength, educating their children, maintaining warm family bonds, and offering compassion to those around her, including raising orphaned children and welcoming nephews into their home. Between 1782 and 1802, the Hamiltons had 8 children: Philip, their firstborn, Angelica, Alexander Jr., James Alexander, John Church, William Stephen, Eliza, and another Philip, named in honor of his older brother after his death later in life. These children brought joy and chaos, laughter and worry, into a household already shaped by the demands of public life and the pressures of national service. Of all their children, the eldest, Philip, held a special place in both parents' hearts. Named for Eliza's father, he was spirited, scholarly, and deeply protective of his father's honor. But tragedy would strike. At just 19 years old, Philip was killed in a duel in 1801, defending his father's reputation. The blow to the Hamilton family was profound, rattling the household with grief that would linger long after the shots had faded. Even the harmony of family life could not shield them from the turbulence of Alexander's public career. His extramarital affair with Maria Reynolds and his subsequent decision to publish the details in the Reynolds pamphlet brought shame and humiliation that Eliza had to confront with resilience. Yet she endured, not out of blind loyalty, but through a deep well of faith, patience, and devotion that would sustain her long after her husband's death. Home for Hamilton was never quiet or simple. It was a place where love and legacy intersected with public ambition, where the laughter of children mixed with the weight of national concern, and where every joy was shadowed by the pressure of expectations, as both a father and a founding father. It was a family forged in the furnace of nation-building, shaped by love and loss, and enduring beyond the turbulent times they lived through. Chapter 11. The Scandal. In the calm of Philadelphia's summer of 1791, Alexander Hamilton, once celebrated for building the nation's financial system, made a decision that would shake his reputation and offer perhaps the earliest political sex scandal in United States history. At 34, Hamilton was the powerful Secretary of the Treasury, a man of ideas and public stature. Into his orderly life came Maria Reynolds, a young woman claiming distress and seeking help. And in claiming help, she ignited a personal and political whirlwind that Hamilton could scarcely have foreseen. Maria was 23. By her account, her husband, James Reynolds, was abusive and her situation desperate. In responding to her plea for funds, Hamilton soon found himself drawn into an extramarital affair that lasted on and off for more than a year. What began as empathy became intimacy, and what began in secrecy soon became a source of vulnerability. James Reynolds, who knew of his wife's infidelity from the start, quickly recognized Hamilton's stature and influence and seized his leverage. Instead of demanding satisfaction on a dueling ground, the conventional recourse of the era, Reynolds chose blackmail, demanding sizable sums of hush money to keep the affair from public exposure. Those payments, totaling more than $1,300, roughly a third of Hamilton's annual income, flowed over months, each one a step deeper into shame and danger. The situation might have ended quietly, but fate intervened. In 1792, James Reynolds and an associate were arrested on unrelated charges of financial wrongdoing, and rumors began to swirl that Hamilton had conspired with Reynolds to misuse federal funds. Confronted by members of Congress with these suspicions, Hamilton made a choice that revealed as much about his character as it did about his predicament. Rather than deny everything and risk whispers of corruption lingering indefinitely, he confessed the affair
and presented the correspondence with both Maria and Reynolds as proof that the money he had paid was blackmail, not embezzlement. His candor reassured his interrogators at the time, and they agreed to keep the matter private. Yet secrets in politics are rarely contained. In 1797, a journalist named James T. Callender published A History of the United States for the year 1796, reviving the Reynolds matter with accusations that Hamilton's dealings with Reynolds had been part of a corrupt financial plot. In response, Hamilton made a decision that has puzzled historians ever since. He wrote and published a 95-page document that admitted the entire affair in painstaking detail to clear his name: the Reynolds pamphlet. The pamphlet was unprecedented. It included Hamilton's own explanation of the affair, the blackmail payments, and a defense against financial misconduct. But it also unfolded the intimate details of his adultery for all to read. In doing so, he chose truth over protection, placing his private moral failure before the public eye in an age when personal reputation was political currency. Some praised his honesty. Many were shocked and disappointed. The disclosure crushed Hamilton's chance of ever holding elected office, including the presidency he might one day have imagined. The scandal was not merely political. It was deeply personal and humiliating, not just for Hamilton, but for his family. His wife, Eliza, was publicly associated with the exposure of her husband's infidelity, and the episode must have pierced the quiet sanctuary of home with embarrassment and grief. Some historians argue that Hamilton's decision to publish the pamphlet was driven by a warrior's instinct to control the narrative, to defeat his political enemies at any cost, even while destroying much of what he had built. His pride and commitment to principle compelled him not just to defend himself, but to do so in a way that laid bare his own imperfections. In the end, the scandal did not end Hamilton's career entirely. He continued to wield influence, but its impact was indelible. It revealed the fragile boundary between personal failing and public life in a republic still finding its moral compass. It exposed Hamilton's pride, his readiness to sacrifice reputation for principle, and the self-destructive streak that so often accompanied his brilliance.
Chapter 12. A Nation Divided. By the early 1790s, the United States, barely a decade beyond independence, was no longer a single, unified assembly of revolutionary collaborators. Instead, its debates revealed deep ideological fractures about what this new republic should be, not just whether it should exist. At the center of these tensions stood Alexander Hamilton, architect of the nation's financial system, and Thomas Jefferson, champion of agrarian values and states' rights. Their rivalry was not merely personal, it was foundational, shaping the emerging contours of American politics and giving rise to what historians now call the first party system. Hamilton's vision, rooted in the practical needs of nation-building, emphasized a strong central government with the power to regulate commerce, foster industry, and maintain national credit. His economic program, including federal assumption of state debts and creation of the Bank of the United States, was intended to bind the states together and establish American credibility at home and abroad. For Hamilton, an effective government was not a distant abstraction, but a practical necessity, a means of ensuring stability and prosperity in a world of competing empires. Jefferson saw things differently. Raised in the agrarian traditions of Virginia plantation society, he believed the republic should rest on the independence of yeoman farmers, with states retaining significant authority and the federal government kept deliberately limited. He feared that Hamilton's model,
with its emphasis on centralized finance and urban commerce, would concentrate power in the hands of an elite few and erode the freedoms fought for during the Revolution. These philosophical differences soon hardened into political opposition. In Congress and in the press, Jefferson and his ally James Madison organized fellow critics of Hamilton's policies into what was initially called the anti-administration faction, the precursor to the Democratic-Republican Party. Hamilton's supporters, often merchants, bankers, and urban leaders who stood to benefit from a robust national economy, coalesced around his Federalist Party. The divide was not merely about economics. Foreign policy sharpened the disputes into something more visceral. When revolution engulfed France, Jefferson's faction cheered its Republican ideals and pushed for closer alignment with Paris, rooted in gratitude for French assistance in the American Revolution. Hamilton and most Federalists, wary of radical violence and the geopolitical threat of war, favored neutrality and closer economic ties with Britain. These disagreements spilled into the bitter debates over the Jay Treaty in 1794–95, a pact with Britain that Federalists supported and Republicans vehemently opposed. Partisan rancor extended beyond legislative chambers. Newspapers proliferated with fierce editorials, and political clubs and rallies gave voice to public passions once confined to private councils. Where Hamilton saw order and authority as necessary for liberty's safeguarding, Jefferson and his allies saw central power as a threat to the very liberties their revolution had secured. By the end of the decade, the nation was not merely governed, it was contested. Hamilton's Federalists and Jefferson's Republicans claimed competing visions of what America meant, how it should grow, and who should lead it. This conflict did more than split Congress or influence elections. It transformed the young republic's political landscape, anchoring the idea that divergent visions of freedom and power could coexist, even if uneasily, within the same nation.
Chapter 13. The Death of Philip.
On a cold November night in 1801, the fragile promise of Alexander Hamilton's family, one of the most eminent households in the new United States, was shattered in an instant by violence that seemed almost senseless. Philip Hamilton, the eldest son and pride of his parents, was only 19 years old when he was mortally wounded in a duel with George I. Eker, a young lawyer whose criticism of Alexander in a political speech had ignited a confrontation that ended in tragedy. Philip had grown up in the glow of admiration from both his mother, Elizabeth Schuyler Hamilton, and his father, who saw in his firstborn not just an heir, but the embodiment of future greatness. Born in 1782 and named after his maternal grandfather, General Philip Schuyler, the young man was described as intelligent, earnest, and full of promise. He excelled in his studies at Columbia College and had begun the study of law, following in his father's footsteps, all while nurturing an idealistic sense of honor that was central to elite life in early America. On November 20th, 1801, Philip attended a performance of a comedy at New York's Park Theatre with a friend. There they encountered Eker, whose earlier speech had impugned Alexander's character and suggested he might misuse military power for political ends. Angered at what he perceived as an affront to his father's honor, Philip confronted Eker. The verbal clash escalated, and within days, the two agreed to a duel, a grim custom of the time that placed personal reputation above almost all else. Dueling was illegal in New York, so the meeting was set at Weehawken, New Jersey, the very ground where many had met death in the name of honor. As the sun rose on November 23rd, Philip and Eker stood 10 paces apart over the cold Hudson River. Following the conventions of dueling etiquette, Philip briefly hesitated. Some accounts suggest he intended a delope, or deliberately misfire. But Ika quickly raised his pistol and fired. The bullet struck Philip above the hip, driving deep into his body. He was transported back to Manhattan, where he lingered in pain for hours before dying the next day. For Alexander and Eliza, the blow was indescribable. Friends later recalled that Hamilton was completely overwhelmed with grief, unable to stand steadily at his son's funeral and consumed by sorrow that would never fully lift. A letter from their mutual friend Benjamin Rush conveyed the shared horror of their city, urging them to find solace in Philip's pious final hours. Hamilton's own reply, months later, confessed the depth of his despair. The highest, as well as the eldest hope of my family, has been taken from me. The impact on the Hamilton household was profound and lasting.
Philip's sister Angelica suffered a severe and permanent emotional collapse. Eliza bore another child a few months later and named him Philip in honor of the lost elder son, a testament to the hole left in their hearts. For Alexander himself, the tragedy marked a turning point. His fierce sense of honor, once a guiding principle of his life and politics, now carried the bitter taste of personal loss, a lesson in vulnerability that no achievement in finance, war, or government could erase. In the twilight of that sorrowful year, the Hamilton family had not only lost a son, they had lost, in many ways, a piece of their collective hope. Philip's death would echo forward, shadowing the next tragedies that history would bring to this remarkable family.
Chapter 14. Aaron Burr. In the tapestry of early American politics, Alexander Hamilton and Aaron Burr stood as two extraordinary ambitions, but ambitions shaped by very different principles. Where Hamilton trusted in public service, strong institutions, and the hard work of building a nation, Burr often embodied opportunity without creed, a man whose talent for politics was matched only by his chameleon-like ability to shift positions in pursuit of power. Their rivalry was not the product of a single moment, but a decade of escalating conflict, with each believing the other posed a threat to his vision of America and to his own future. The tension between them had roots as early as 1791, when Burr won a seat in the United States Senate at the expense of Hamilton's father-in-law, General Philip Schuyler. Burr's victory signaled not just a political defeat, but a blow to a Federalist network Hamilton relied upon. In the 1800 presidential election, this rivalry reached a pivotal juncture. Under the original rules of the Electoral College, Thomas Jefferson and Aaron Burr, running mates for the Democratic-Republican Party, tied in electoral votes, throwing the decision to the House of Representatives. For Hamilton, Burr represented the very antithesis of Republican virtue. He believed Burr was a man of no fixed principles, willing to chase advantage wherever it led. Despite the fact that Hamilton deeply disagreed with Jefferson's politics, he saw Jefferson as someone with a consistent ideological framework, however opposed Hamilton might be to it. In a fierce series of letters and conversations with Federalist allies, Hamilton urged them to support Jefferson rather than allow Burr to ascend to the nation's highest office. His argument, ultimately persuasive, helped secure Jefferson's presidency and relegated Burr to the vice presidency, a position of prestige but minimal influence. That outcome did not temper Burr's animosity. Rather, it fueled it. As vice president, Burr found himself marginalized, excluded from Jefferson's inner circle, and increasingly desperate for a path back into power. In 1804, Burr turned his sights on the New York governorship, hoping a victory there would revive his flagging career. Most Federalists, including Hamilton,
saw Burr's ambitions as dangerous. A large faction supported alternate candidates. Hamilton lent his influence to opposing Burr, making statements, later published in newspapers, that questioned Burr's character and trustworthiness. For Burr, these public condemnations were the final insult. In a political culture that still placed honor alongside ambition, Burr felt compelled to respond. What began as a dispute in legislative halls and political clubs had become personal. When a letter was published suggesting Hamilton had expressed a despicable opinion of Burr, the vice president challenged him to a duel affair of honor. A duel. Hamilton's decision to accept was fraught with contradiction. He had long decried dueling as a practice, especially after the death of his beloved son Philip in such a confrontation years earlier. Yet Hamilton also understood that refusing a challenge could be construed as cowardice, a fatal blow to a reputation he believed essential to public life. Standing upon the dueling ground at Weehawken, New Jersey, on July 11, 1804, the culmination of this bitter, slow-burning feud placed not only his own fate, but the fragile heart of the young republic at a precipice. In the end, the duel did more than take Hamilton's life. It laid bare the costs of political rivalry in a nation still defining its norms, and the way honor and consequence could merge into tragedy. Burr survived, but his career never recovered. And for Hamilton, whose mind had helped build a nation, that morning, among the mist and pistols, there came the tragic coda to a life driven by fierce conviction and fraught rivalry. Chapter 15. Weehawken. The morning of July 11th, 1804, broke with a stillness that betrayed its coming violence. Before the sun rose high over the Hudson River, two men, Alexander Hamilton and Aaron Burr, set out separately from Manhattan, each crossing the quiet water into Weehawken, New Jersey, where the steep cliffs beneath the Palisades formed a secluded dueling ground. Cradled in early light, the spot was both symbolic and tragic. It lay not far from where Hamilton's son Philip had died just 3 years earlier in another duel. Though the practice of dueling had been outlawed in both New York and New Jersey, the code of honor still exerted powerful influence among gentlemen of the era. Each man was accompanied by a second, a trusted friend responsible for ensuring the duel's formalities, and by early dawn, they were alone on the rocky shore, pistols in hand. According to the records of the seconds, Hamilton raised his pistol as though to test the light, perhaps deliberate, perhaps uncertain, and some accounts suggest he intended to fire harmlessly into the air rather than strike Burr. When the command was given, shots rang out within moments of each other. Hamilton's bullet, whether intentional or accidental, flew wide. Burr's did not. It struck Hamilton in the lower abdomen, above the right hip, shattering a rib, damaging internal organs, and lodging near his spine. The great mind who had written and argued so fiercely for the nation's future fell to the ground almost instantly. Hamilton's seconds and physician, Dr. David Hosack, lifted him with grim urgency and ferried him across the Hudson to Greenwich Village in Manhattan. He was taken to the home of his friend William Bayard Jr., where the grievous toll of the wound became unmistakable. Despite the pain and the certainty of his condition, Hamilton faced his last hours with courage mixed with reflection. He asked for Holy Communion, expressing a desire for spiritual solace, even as his body failed him. Friends and family, including his wife Elizabeth and their children, gathered at his side when they arrived, summoned across the river by the terrible news. For more than 30 hours, Hamilton lingered, conscious of both the physical agony and the emotional weight of his choices.
It was not simply the pain of a mortal wound that defined those hours, but the sum of a lifetime's ambition, triumphs, failures, and relationships, converging in silence, broken only by farewells and the murmur of prayer. At 2:00 in the afternoon on July 12, 1804, Alexander Hamilton, soldier, statesman, lawyer, architect of the young republic, drew his last breath. News of his death spread swiftly through New York and beyond. Stores closed, flags were flown at half-mast, and the city grappled with grief for a man whose life had been woven into the fabric of the nation's founding and early struggles.
For many, Hamilton was a martyr to an outdated code of honor. For others, he was a tragic figure who paid the ultimate price for political and personal rivalry. Burr, meanwhile, found his own career in ruins, accused of murder in both New York and New Jersey, and never again achieving political prominence. In the quiet that followed, Hamilton's legacy began to settle into history's ledger. He left behind ideas that would shape America's economic and constitutional arrangement, and a family who mourned a father and husband taken too soon. More than a century later, his story would find renewed life in popular culture, a testament to the complexity of a figure whose genius was matched by his contradictions. But in those last hours in Greenwich Village, surrounded by the faces he cherished, Alexander Hamilton was simply a man confronting the consequences of choices made in the name of honor, rivalry, and a nation still young and fragile.
Epilogue. Legacy beyond the stage. When Alexander Hamilton died in 1804, few could have predicted how profoundly his ideas would outlive his battered body. Yet over the 2 centuries that followed, the institutions he championed, the arguments he forged, and the very questions he raised about government, economy, and identity became woven deep into the American experience. From the Constitution he helped interpret to the financial architecture he designed as the first Secretary of the Treasury, his influence reaches far beyond any single lifetime. Hamilton's vision of a strong federal system was not merely a reaction to the fragility of the early republic. It was a foundational debate that continues to shape American governance to this day. His insistence that the national government could exercise powers necessary to meet its responsibilities, a stance rooted in his broad interpretation of the necessary and proper clause, remains influential in constitutional scholarship and judicial reasoning. These debates, first pitched against figures like Thomas Jefferson, echo in modern arguments over federal authority and states' rights. Economically, Hamilton's fingerprints are everywhere. The idea of public credit binding the states together, creation of the Bank of the United States that set precedents for a national banking system, tariffs and policies promoting manufacturing growth that helped orient the country toward industrial development. These were not mere technical accomplishments. They were visionary assertions that a republic could harness economic power as well as political principle to thrive in a competitive world. Yet Hamilton's legacy has also been refracted through the lens of culture and art, most notably through Lin-Manuel Miranda's Broadway musical, Hamilton. Since its debut, the production has become a cultural phenomenon, winning awards like the Pulitzer Prize, multiple Tony Awards, and Grammy accolades, and bringing Hamilton's story to millions of people who might never have opened a history book. With a diverse cast and modern musical language, the show reframes early American history as a story of ambition, struggle, and possibility, making the past resonate for a global audience. Yet popular retellings inevitably simplify and reshape nuance. The musical often compresses events, emphasizes certain relationships, and dramatizes debates for theatrical effect.
While it celebrates Hamilton's immigrant origins and relentless drive, historians remind us that the real man was a complex, sometimes contradictory figure. Brilliant in financial theory, controversial in policy, and very human in his flaws. What endures, both in classrooms and on stages, is not just the arc of Hamilton's biography, but why his story still matters. A testament to the power of ideas, the struggles of building a nation, and the ways individual ambition and public purpose can clash and converge. It is a reminder that history is not static, but lived, debated, and reinterpreted by every generation. If you've enjoyed this deep dive into the life and legacy of Alexander Hamilton, subscribe to the channel, hit the like button, and leave a comment on what part of his journey resonated most with you. Let's keep uncovering the real stories behind the myths together.